Still good morning. It's all confusing today, right? First day after the time change. We move forward or backward? I can't remember. Anyway, good morning. I'm Gretchen Spreitzer, and I'm part of the Center for Positive Organizational Scholarship, and I have the delight of being able to welcome Ryan this morning. Ryan is the fifth, I think, in our series on generative practice, and we have one more yet this term, which Janet will be sending out information and a reminder about. In case you've been wondering where Janet is this morning, she's homesick, so we're kind of cobbling along without her. So we appreciate your flexibility with us this morning. But the good news is that Ryan is not sick. Ryan arrived yesterday, and we're really excited to have him here. I want to just do a short introduction of Ryan, and I'll share a little bit of his kind of his academic prowess, how he makes a difference. But then I also have a couple stories to share about Ryan too. So first of all, Ryan's on the faculty at the University of Virginia at the Darden School. Previously, he was at Washington University in St. Louis, and before that, he did his doctoral work here at Michigan. And he's clearly made a difference in a number of different realms, whether it's research. He's published in a wide variety of outlets, including a wonderful book that came out last year with Bob, his dad. And he's written on a variety of different topics, including high-impact conversations, courage, a really interesting article on the United Airlines Flight 93, the one that crashed right into the field in Pennsylvania. Very interesting paper. Some wonderful work on energy and on flow in work groups. In fact, he won the Lickert Dissertation Award here at Michigan in 2006 for an outstanding dissertation. So clearly Ryan's made an impact in the realm of research. He's also made an impact in the realm of teaching. I've called him several times, brainstorming about ideas on teaching different topics, including downsizing in the classroom. Can you believe that? You downsize your class? But, you know, Ryan, he studies courage. He does things like this. He's written a number of cases and tools. He has a wonderful video on resilience on the POS website that can be used for teaching, which I highly recommend. So he's clearly made an impact in teaching. He's also made an impact in service in a whole bunch of different ways. But for somebody as junior as Ryan is, he's made an impact in important ways in the academy with the Organization Development and Change Division, where he's been an officer. And he's on several editorial boards, including Organizational Science and Academy of Management Review. So Ryan clearly makes a difference as an academic in all of these different realms. But I first got to know Ryan. It was very interesting as a high school student when Ryan was working at the Population Studies Center here at the university, where my husband was doing research as a doctoral student. And I remember, you know how often when undergraduates work as work studies here that they're a little bit invisible. You kind of know who they are, maybe know their name, but they kind of work under the radar screen. Not Ryan. As an undergraduate at the Population Studies Center, everybody knew Ryan. Ryan ran around with all sorts of great energy doing terrific work. And I have this wonderful memory of him as the DJ at their holiday party out at the Matai Botanical Gardens. And I thought, this high school kid is going to be the DJ for this, you know, this is going to be a complete misfit. You know, these are all these old fogey faculty members, and here's this young upstart with these, you know, fun songs. And Ryan had everybody up and moving. It was the funnest holiday party that I have been to. So that was my first set of interactions with Ryan as a high school student. Ryan went off and did his undergraduate work at Brigham Young, and then came back and did his doctoral work here. And he was just finishing up as I returned as a faculty member here. And again, I could see how integrated he was and how people respected him here. And then my most recent set of interactions with Ryan happened about 18 months ago when I was working with Chak Fu. Is Chak Fu here today? No. Working with Chak Fu on a paper, we were trying to look at notions of human energy at work, and we were reading a number of different things that Ryan had written, including a wonderful book chapter he had done. And Chak-Fu and I were a little bit stuck on a few things, so we called up Ryan, and he was very generous with his ideas and with his time. And at the end of the conversation, I said to Chak-Fu, I said, we need to invite Ryan to be part of this paper with us. And Ryan graciously agreed, and he said, but only if I'm the third author. He said, I don't think I have very much I can contribute. Well, to make a long story short, after 18 months, Ryan is no longer the third author, but he's the intellectual leader on the paper and is now the first author, and it's going to be coming out as part of the Academy of Management Annals. So I feel like I've been really blessed to be part of Ryan's life in a number of different ways, and I'm honored to be his collaborator and friend. So let's give Ryan a warm welcome back to Michigan.
Thank you, Gretchen. I have to admit that introduction brought back a lot of memories for me. Shortly after Gretchen came back to the University of Michigan as a faculty member, as I was finishing my doctoral program, my wife Amy and I went to lunch with Gretchen and to dinner, I guess it was, with Gretchen and Bob. And I let Gretchen in on the fact that my college major was a result of Gretchen, and she never knew it, because my father was so impressed with how Gretchen's undergrad had prepared her for her doctoral work that he said, you have to do what Gretchen did. And so I went off, and she had I can't remember what it was called, some analytics degree, but the whole reason I majored in statistics as an undergrad was because of Gretchen Spreitzer, even though she never knew it. And then that made me think about other, what can I say? And then my other memory that popped in when she said that was coming to the University of Michigan as an applicant, interviewee for the doctoral program, and walking into Jane Dutton's office, and Jane said, "You're the kid who washed my windows." Like, yeah, that was me. So, DJ, window washer, whatever it is. Eventually, if this career doesn't work out for me, I've got things I can fall back on. I want to begin by, first of all, saying thank you to the faculty in the POS Center for having me out, and especially to Janet Max for all of the work she does to make this happen even when she's not here. And I also want to offer a special thanks this morning to my collaborators on this presentation. It turns out I've been working long hours lately for a variety of reasons, and I was trying to figure out some way I could get my work done and also spend time with my family. So I recruited my children to help me make this presentation. So I'd like to introduce you to some faces you're going to be seeing throughout the presentation. Mason, Katie, Andrew, and Chloe are my kids, and you'll be seeing them again and again, and offer them my thanks. And then also the photographer who made it possible, which is my wife, Amy. And with that in place, let me start with a story or two to kick it off. It turns out that there's a book, I think the publication date was 1972, written by Henry Mintzberg, who's one of the leading thinkers in the field of strategic management. And he had this really interesting question. He said, we spend all this time studying managers. What do managers actually do? So they went around and followed managers around to see what managers do. And turned out that even though he wrote an entire book on the topic, you could sum up what managers do in one word. They talk. Which, on the surface, may sound a little humorous, but actually is quite profound if you think about it. Is what do managers do? They talk. In every way, management in some form or another is about communication. Now, that's interesting because most of us think that we're pretty good at talking because we've been doing it all our lives. But there is an interesting thing that happened to me a few years ago when, after 10 years of marriage, my wife finally broke me down and got me to watch the movie Pride and Prejudice, after years of resistance. Now, those of you may be familiar, it's a British romance, and some people, watched the movie over and over and over again, and so finally, with much reluctance, I sat down, and I saw this wonderful scene. And in this scene, Colin Firth had just finished watching Elizabeth, can't remember her last name, but she had been playing the piano, and they started up this conversation. And as they started up the conversation, she asked him why he was always so reticent and distant from everybody. He said, I find that I'm not very good at small talk and social conversation, so I just don't do it because I'm not a part of it. And she said, I find that I'm not very good at playing the piano, but I usually assume that's my fault because I haven't practiced. And I think that's an interesting way to think about it. We think because we've been doing it all our lives that we're good at it, and yet every once in a while we might meet that person or have that experience where we realize that there are profound things that we can do with talk that we don't because we take it for granted. And that drives much of my interest in what I do as a researcher, as a scholar, and as I try to help people. So as you look at the title here today, the talk is called Positive Organizational Communication, Co-authoring Exceptional Realities Even in Trying Times. The subtitle, the second half, is what I'm hoping to do for you today, is to perhaps inspire you and give you some ideas or tools about how to co-author exceptional realities and even do so if things are difficult. The first half, positive organizational communication, you can probably guess is a play on the positive organizational scholarship movement. And what I'm doing here is in the field of organizational scholarship, most of the work tends to be done in either psychology or sociology. And there's not a whole lot that's been taken from communication research and communication theory. And so what I want to do today is take just a few ideas from communication research and present them to you as ways of helping us to understand organization and what they suggest we should do, and then flip it and say, what happens if we take these ideas and look at them through a positive lens? Could it transform the way we work in some way? So that's my agenda. To help us do that, I'm going to start out with a case. And this is a case of an organization I once worked with. Let's see. That went the wrong way. Here we go. OK. So this case is a story of a government organization. And it's been through some hard times. They've had 2 years of budget cuts with all the things that tend to come with budget cuts. And there's another one looming. And as a result, everyone in the organization is really concerned about their jobs, about getting fired, what's going to happen. And so all the things that come with people being concerned about their jobs are going along with this as people are getting extra work piled up because they're doing the work of people who didn't make it through the previous budget cuts and all sorts of problems that are going on. And with that, at the beginning, when the first of those 3 budget cuts began, the director put together a design team and asked them to take 5 different support departments throughout the organization and to merge them together into one training department. And their job was to go around and help all the employees improve their client service. And so they were some of the best client service people in the system. But they were given the explicit mandate that they were not to provide the same kind of support. They weren't to provide administrative support. They weren't to provide technological support in terms that they could help people learn to use the technology effectively, but they weren't supposed to, set up their technology for them or do other mundane tasks. That was being sent back to the employees to take care of their own support. And then they moved 24 trainers in with 6 managing trainers and put them on a 3-year rotating position so that they would work for 3 years and then others would come in and people would go through the assignment. And the net effect was that people in the system were pretty upset about losing all the support that they had had before and weren't very accepting of these new trainers and what they were doing. So the other thing that the design team did is they made them locally operating. So the government organization had a lot of buildings in various geographical locations to service their area, and yet they were centrally managed. And there was a philosophy behind this, which is that if the employees throughout the system were going to be trained by these people, and the people were under the local building administrators, then people are going to think, if I go to get training, I'm going to be evaluated. And as a result, the training wouldn't be developmental, it would be evaluative, and they wanted to avoid that. They wanted them to actually really use the trainers to become effective and to really develop themselves in their client service. And so that in terms of the third bullet down, that the building administrators were not in control of the situation. And because they weren't in control of it, they were pretty upset about that. They wanted support and development in their building to be under them. And so some of them were very upset about this. The other thing is they expected it to be a pull marketing system. So the employees had to request the trainer's training. The trainers couldn't go out, and neither could the building administrators push people into accepting the training. It had to come to them so that it would truly be developmental. Well, as you can imagine, in a system where all the employees are insecure because there's looming budget cuts and they can get fired, the last thing I want to do is go out and admit I'm not good at something by asking trainers to help me with it. And so where this pull was going to come from was somewhat ambiguous. All right, so hopefully this is painting a picture of even trying times. All right, so they show up to work, and they have a few problems, as we've articulated. One is they have to drum up demand, because they're not allowed to push training on people. Somehow they have to get it, so they have to create demand somehow. There's thousands of employees into the system and 30 trainers. So how are we, even if we manage to drum up the demand, where are we going to get the supply to meet it? There's confusion among the employees. What exactly, now that we've gotten rid of all these 5 departments that we're used to, how do we actually use these people? What is appropriate? We're not allowed to ask them for support. What are we allowed to ask them for? And all this confusion about what was going on. And then finally, as this started to develop, there became this kind of in-group, out-group tension between the managing trainers and the trainers over various issues that they were struggling with. So, with all these problems in place, here was the dilemma I encountered. I spent 18 months, give or take, working with this organization. I don't think I met a single person in this organization who wasn't competent, who wasn't intelligent, who wasn't well-intentioned. In fact, these trainers in particular all had the same goals. And yet, in spite of it, they still had these problems. They had trouble with the in-group, out-group thing. They had trouble with communication. They had trouble with how they coordinated their activities between them. There was confusion among the employees throughout the system about what to do. And so it becomes this question, when you have competent, intelligent, well-intended people all working towards the same goal, why on earth should there be such a problem with this? Now, what I'd like to do is explore with you the role of communication in this, in explaining why they had such problems and what they could do about it. So, to do that, let me first give you a quick overview of organizational communication. It turns out that in the field of organizational communication, which has actually been going on since Barnard in the 1930s, but has received more or less attention over the years, that communication initially focused on communication, something that happens in organizations. And so it wasn't so different from what happens anywhere else, except you just have to pay attention to the context or the container that an organization is. Eventually, people started thinking about communication as something that causes organizing. So as I talk to you, it leads to us to organize in a particular way, and that way we've organized then in turn influences how I communicate later. And most recently, there's been another wave in the way people think about communication. And that is that communication is organizing. There's no container or not container. There's no causing and then affecting me later. It's that every time that we communicate with each other, we are organizing or creating reality in the world in some new way. That organization is a creative process, and we're constantly doing it even if we don't recognize what we're doing. Oops. And when I say that, what I specifically want to focus on is that organizing happens through a process of manipulating symbols to create meanings. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, when we talk, we're using words, sentences, letters to make up the words. And these symbols we manipulate by putting them into sentences or by using them in some ways. But it's not necessarily even just words, right? So I may, in other words, use objects or move my body or give you nonverbal signals. And all of these signals are symbols that I'm manipulating in some way that we use to understand our world. If you think about it like a baby just gets an ongoing flux of data that none of it is differentiable. But over time, as that baby grows up, you begin to develop categories and ways of cataloging things and putting them together, and you begin to make sense or create meaning in your world, and that meaning organizes it. And especially when we communicate with each other, then we develop, when we agree on particular meanings for particular ways of expressing things, we've begun to organize through our shared meaning what the world is and how we've defined it together. So these meanings define both whether organization happens at all and what kind of organization we have. All right, so that's the fundamental premise that I'm going to work from today. Let me stop there. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? All right, that could be a good sign or a bad sign. All right. So, in talking about communication research, there's lots and lots of different observations that have been made in this research over the years. There's no way I can even begin to cover all of it. What I'm going to do is take 3 very basic observations from the communication research and discuss those together today, and then we'll go back with each one and talk about how it applies to that case I started with in the beginning. The first of these, so the 3 points are, number 1, miscommunication is the norm. Number 2, communication is organizing. And then finally, truth is conferred through feeling. All right? So let me dive into the first one. Miscommunication is the norm. All right, so back to our trainers in the government system. One of the things that happened as the trainers started to evolve in their new role as a department is that the managing trainers would convene them every week or every 2 weeks or whatever it was to kind of get them all on the same page, help them develop their skills, find out what kind of problems they were encountering as they were out in the system and work through them together and that sort of thing. And over time, the trainers, not the managing trainers, but the regular trainers, began to resent these train-the-trainer meetings. And they would, be very upset about having to spend time in these again. They're not useful. I could be out there working with the employees and getting things done. And the lead trainers just couldn't comprehend this. So they had a very clear plan. We were trying to make a difference in this organization. If we don't coordinate and get on the same page about this and develop our skills for doing it, how are we supposed to succeed at this? And what they would say is, you know what? We've told them that. When we go and interview them, and we interview people throughout the whole system, and we'd say, feedback, it looks like your trainers resent doing these train-the-trainer meetings. But we've told them why we've done it, and they agree with us. They say, okay, that's fine. Why are they so resentful? They couldn't figure out, if we've told them, why are they resentful? Similarly, with the, that went too far. Come on. My clicker wasn't set up to work very well, so I have to go back to do this. When the employees, were out and we go and interview them and find out what's going on, we say, what do you think about the training system? The employees would actually say something very similar. They would say, we don't know what we can ask the trainers to do. So we'd go to one and say, no, I've never worked with the trainers. Why haven't you worked with them? Because I don't know what I'm allowed to ask them to do. So then we go and give that feedback to the people in the central office who designed the system, and the people in the central office would say, what do you mean? We wrote out job descriptions, we gave them lists, and we sent it out, in an email to the whole system. How come they don't know what they can ask them to do? We told them. Now, when you think about that, why would that happen? People have actually explained things. Sometimes have even agreed to them. Why would that happen? Axley suggests in a 1984 article that the problem is that most of us as human beings actually walk around assuming most of the time that our communication is and will be successful. And he says that's a bad assumption. In fact, it's so prevalent in our society that we get to this conclusion, that whenever we communicate, we say something, we send out an email, missive, we do whatever it is we do, and it comes back that people don't understand or they're not doing what we expect them to do, we're shocked, surprised, annoyed by this. And we don't understand. And he says, in fact, it's what he calls the conduit metaphor. If you look at the way we talk about communicating with each other and you analyze those words, we always use words that imply a conduit, that assumes that communication works like a tunnel, and I just put my message in and it goes out to the other end, and so why wouldn't it work? When in fact that's not how communication works at all. Communication is a process of producing texts And once I produce a text, that text can do whatever it wants. You interpret it how you want, and there's no tunnel for it to go through. And so when we go around assuming that communication works, we're making a bad assumption right from the start. Now, if that's the case, then we've got a little bit of a problem on our hands. The other thing that goes on is to understand why it is that when I produce a text and you interpret it, you get something different from what I intended. We have to understand what a text is or what we create when we create a text. And what we create is a series of symbols that we've manipulated, like we talked about before. And all symbols are metaphorical. All right? So if I say a word or I do anything that's symbolic, that means that I'm using a symbol instead of the real thing. If I say the word apple, it's not an apple, it's the word apple. It's a representation of that. And that means that we're working in metaphor. And because it's a metaphor, all metaphors can be pluralistic. Right? So when I use a word, as I'll show you here on this graph below, when we went around and interviewed people after we were done, we did a semiotic analysis of what the word trainer means to people. Turns out there's lots of things that trainers mean to people that they use in everyday conversation all the time. And different people use different ones in different social communities, and all of these get manipulated. And so you have plural, every symbol can have multiple meanings that people may or may not even agree on. Now, on top of that, we also have the problem that there are a zillion symbols out there. So not only there's a zillion symbols per, a zillion meanings per symbol, but you can use symbols all kinds of the place, all over the place, dragging each other out. And so the potential for human miscommunication is endless. It's actually quite staggering when you think about it. Now, if human miscommunication is so staggering, it raises the question, so that's the other point, is that anything can be a message. So let me illustrate this really quickly. One of the stories we heard as we went out and worked with these trainers is that one set of trainers were put into a building that had an office with a window in it, and the window was in the main hallway of the building. And one of the stories we heard is that one of the employees would walk by the window and see the trainers in the office typing on the computer. So the trainers had no intention of sending any messages, of communicating whatsoever as they're sitting there typing in the office. And yet, anything can be a message. So the employee walking by looks in the window and says, see, they're not training. They're just using up these resources that could be going to other people who would be employees. All they're in there is working on their computers, typing away. How can you train if you're not even with people? And created their own interpretation of it. And so then they go on, and these trainers who had no intention of sending a message whatsoever have now suddenly had a very clear message communicated to other people about them without ever intending to, because of the way these symbols have been interpreted and manipulated. And so anything can be a message, which gives us one more avenue of miscommunication. So with all this miscommunication, one of the questions that communication scholars have had to ask is, how do we get by? I mean, like, how do we live from day to day considering the fact that our potential for miscommunication is so bad? And in asking that question, there's well, let me ask you. How do we get by? If the potential for miscommunication is so rife, how is it that you survive from day to day, that you function as a team over here? Or do you? Just kidding. Any thoughts? How do we get by from day to day when there's so much potential for miscommunication?
We ask for feedback and check
Okay, good. So if you didn't hear, she said we ask for feedback and check our communication. Which may explain some things as well. Other thoughts? Yeah. Okay, so we muddle. We try things out. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. How did you get that? So you said there's a miscommunication again. So she said that we have a common schema or way of thinking about things that we've developed with other people. And my question was, well, how did you get that? I mean, can we even be sure that we really have that? How did you get it? Okay, good. I'm going to add a label to that here, and the label is context. We have context in terms of both our, there we go again. By context, I mean we have a historical context. If we've been working with other people together for a while, then we've seen how they behave and how we behave in different situations. We've seen what happens when we're at work versus when we're in the restaurant versus when we're elsewhere. We have all this history. We also have the social context of the moment. So I can see he's saying X. He's talking about writing a report or whatever it is, and he has his pen in his hand, and so he must be referring to his report or whatever it is because I have that physical and social surrounding to help me make sense of it. And I may have other contexts as well in terms of other documents that have been produced before or places that I've been or whatever it may be to refer to. And in fact, Francois Quinn uses the move of actually putting a hyphen between con and text, which suggests that context is simply the many other texts that already exist with, because the con is the Latin word with. When we look around, there's a zillion texts around us, and most of the time we muddle through good enough in life with our communication because we have all these alternative texts to turn to help us make sense of the focal text that we're working on. Feedback, for example, if I give you one text that you're focusing on and you don't understand it and you ask for feedback, that gives us another context, a text with, to help me make sense of the first text that we've produced in our conversation. Now, that leads to the next question then. If we're set with all kinds of problems and possibilities of miscommunication, and the way that we succeed, or at least muddle through most of the time, is with context, what does that suggest that we need to do if we want to communicate more successfully more often? Feedback, I think, was a good answer. What else? Go. Yes? Excellent. So a follow-up question. The more we can get that, so there's multiple ways to get that feedback flowing. One is to give feedback. The other is to ask for feedback to help me with that. Good. What else? Yeah. Yeah. So if I'm a manager, one of the things I can do is say, okay, here's what we're working on today. Before we get in, let me tell you why we're working on this together and actually paint a picture and pull in and tell them which pieces of the context are relevant. Good. Yes? Good, good. So not only giving the feedback, but if you restate it in different words, then those different words, people can say, yes, that's it, no, that's not it. But because I use different words, it helps me to triangulate on that meaning. Let me give you just a couple of more that come from the research on this. So the first one is expect miscommunication. If you go in expecting successful communication, you'll probably end up annoyed, angry, and upset about things when it doesn't turn out the way you expect. If you expect miscommunication, then it won't be a surprise when things don't go so well, and you can then build on that by triangulating, getting feedback, adding context, all these things we talked about. Number two, use multiple media. So if I'm trying, so the next three, use multiple media, communicate multiple times, and ask questions, are about when I'm trying to communicate something to the other, to you. And if I'm doing that, if I do it in person, on the phone, by an email, through another person, whatever it may be, the more media I use to communicate, the more likely as it comes from these different angles that you're going to make sense of it in some way that will be more conducive with what I'm intending when I communicate. Multiple times in multiple ways. So the restating would be another example of that. Trying to get that through. Asking questions was what we heard over here. So tell me what you heard me say so I know if we're on the same page. Then, if I'm receiving communication, things that I can do to facilitate that are, one, be cautious of secondhand information. Go and confirm it. Cross-check it with multiple people or across multiple times. And finally, make sure you get information from multiple sources. So let's stop and go back to our trainers and our managing trainers. They're in a situation where they're actually, I want to do the other one. So let's imagine that you're a trainer and you found out that the employees don't know whether or not they can call on you for help because they don't know what's appropriate to ask you to do. how could you use these guidelines to rectify that situation? Yes? I'm sorry, I didn't hear the end of that. Okay, so they could let them know. Now, the people in the central office would say, we've already let them know. We sent out a document about that. But, okay, so send out the document again. It would be a very practical thing I could do to make sure I communicate multiple times. Okay, people are more likely to read an email with less text than more text. Great. Yeah? Okay, good. So another media to get it across through. Yes? Great. So on the organization website, we'll have a bunch of little videos that will be different employees telling stories about how I worked with the coaches and what it did for me. Excellent. Yes? Yes, they are. So they could talk to people. Excellent. Good. All right, so you get the gist of this, and this is relatively simple and innocuous. Most of these suggestions, I think, once you have them in front of you, are not that surprising. And yet, the shocking thing is how rarely we actually do this in organizations. Kim? Yeah. No, I wouldn't go that far. All right, so there's an issue of degrees here, I would say. But I have a set of intentions that I've worked on for a number of years, developing material around communication and its positive lens. And I have a whole set of beliefs about what I think that means. I believe at the end of this one, that some of you will have some portion of them. Now, in saying this, there may be something that we find out later that in what I've built up over these years is just wrong, and maybe it's good that you don't pick it all up. But assuming that, just looking only at picking up versus not picking it up, I assume that nobody's going to have a total grasp of everything I say in an hour and a half. And some of you will have more than others, and some of you will have different parts than others. And that isn't necessarily bad, as we'll talk about more in a moment, but I assume there will be miscommunication that happens in this meeting today. Fair enough. Maybe a choice of words there may work better one way or another. Yeah. Yes? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And the context makes a big difference in that. I mean, right here, most of you are probably feeling no threat in sitting here and listening to me, whereas, you may be feeling a fair amount of threat if you're one of these employees has to decide whether or not to work with a trainer, and that's going to affect things. And it may be that I say something, to use what Kim was saying, that you pick up where it's completely different from what I intended you to pick up here. But it actually is quite a good thing for you to have picked up. You'll have some insight because you connect it with some other past experience or some other context that makes new meaning for you that's useful, but it's still technically inadequate or miscommunication in terms of what I intended, at least. Yeah, Emily.
So, at the beginning of this talk, Gretchen stood up there and told us about you.
Oh, it was a big miscommunication. Don't tell me. I don't want to know.
Well, we triggered that in all of us
Yeah.
before you even started talking, so that we had this additional context of you. And I wonder if this is like something else that's going on with communication, with you being able to enhance your effectiveness with living your life a certain way where you can consistently understand what you're going to be talking about and what the point of it is.
Oh. One of the things that I'll touch on today, but I won't go in very deeply, that I think is important in what you're saying there, is that we communicate who we are, right? And that's not necessarily in the words that we choose to use. And we'll dive into that more later, not as deeply as we could, but a little bit later. But I think there's some really important things involved in that comment that you made there. In the comments that we've just picked up right here, there's some questions about, this principle, how it works, when it doesn't work, what we should be concerned about it. And I think that's appropriate because while this tends to work, that, getting feedback, using the context, whatever else, there are some problems with this approach. What problems do you think might exist with expecting miscommunications, multiple media? Because in some sense, by asking these questions, you're sensing some of them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it never goes away. Ah. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, this is work that never stops. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So to some extent, it doesn't limit the constraints that I face in trying to communicate. Yeah. Good. Yep. A little bit better than useless. All right. That's a bold claim. Care to say more?
I just think when you hand this to the trainers, they're not going to change their behavior.
Ah, okay. What would?
Well, I'll see what you say later.
Yes.
The clarity of the strategic purposefulness of the trainer.
Ah, so they may not know. Not only can we not know their intents, they might not know their intents. Okay, fair enough.
If I teach a group to expect miscommunication, and someone in there really doesn't want to have much interest in communicating anyway, one response will be, oh, expect miscommunication, why bother? I just wait and do it my way.
Good. I like that. I'll come back to that one in a minute. Okay. You were going to say the same thing. So there's an issue here that I'm also going to get into in just a minute that I'm picking up on what you're saying in terms of the fixity of meaning. That if meanings get too fixed, we might have a problem there as well. Yeah, sure. Yeah, you lose some of that spontaneity. Yep.
Talking about the degree of nuance in the case, makes me think about how ineffective large-scale corporate communication can be. How do you fix that? We are walking the fine line. Like, how could it possibly make any sense for one email or a series of emails to only come out of a central communication office that has no real understanding of being able to understand the difference between individual employees' motivations or their reasons for being involved, that a chain of communication so that there's a reason you have a direct supervisor and that direct supervisor can speak more directly to you versus just sort of one-size-fits-all corporate communication.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just as I look through this approach, it seems somewhat inefficient in the sense that you're putting all this effort forth, multiple media, multiple times, multiple ways. Is there a way to get the message across so that people do understand it without having to go through all of those things?
Yeah, the sheer amount of work involved. Let me take one more and then we'll.
One thing about the inefficiency is like with this list, you assume that it's entirely the responsibility of the
the responsibility, yes. Yes. Okay, excellent. You guys are really good at critical things for a positive organizational scholarship show. All right. So I'm just going to focus on a few of the things that you mentioned, but you captured most of them, I think. Number one is this assumes that the ideal is fixed meanings. Now, there is value to fixed meanings, right? Because in terms of just understanding one another, our meanings need to be at least relatively and at least temporarily fixed for us to be able to communicate. But that may not be the ideal now or all the time in a given situation. Number two, there's this one-way aspect of it that we were just hearing about a second ago. Those recommendations are all about how do I communicate better when I'm doing the communicating to or when I'm receiving from. But they're not about how do we communicate together. And then finally, there's the issue that metaphorical flexibility actually can be positive. So now let's flip it on the end. We've looked at communication as a problem. Now let's look at communication in terms of possibility. So the first way that I think we can use metaphorical flexibility to our advantage is illustrated well by a story that Ed Schein told in his classic book, Organizational Culture and Leadership. And in this story, he talks about a British transportation company that had existed for 100 years. And they had started with a royal mandate, a royal something, I can't remember what it was, but so they had ties with the king and queen. And as a result, their trucks for 100 years had been painted blue with the insignia of the royal insignia on it. And there was extreme value poured by the employees into these trucks with their insignias, and it represented for them what was really important to them as a company and had meanings that people generally tended to agree on, and not only agree on, but agree strongly on. And at the time when the new CEO came in, performance was plummeting, things were going wrong, and he was brought in to turn around the company. And after observing for a few months, the first thing he did was he dictated that all of the trucks in the company had to be painted white. And the calamity and the rancor and the problems this caused as people came in and pleaded with him, please don't paint our trucks white. It will destroy our performance and destroy the identity of the company. And you wouldn't think this, but I mean, over the trucks being painted white, just all this, and he politely and calmly listened, and then he said, no, we need to paint them white and do it soon. So all the trucks got painted white. And then something strange happened. As the people who drove the trucks drove around doing their duties, all of their customers were really curious. Why are your trucks white? How are you going to paint them? And suddenly, all these people started listening to the customers. And they became more market-focused. And they started thinking about what their identity was and what they could do. And the culture of the company transformed to become a market-focused company because they painted the trucks white. Now, this is back to the issue about everything can be a message or a metaphor. In that situation, what that CEO did for the company by painting the trucks white is something you and I can do all the time in our everyday conversation. And the way that we do this, if we can discipline ourselves enough, is to approach people that we want to communicate with as if miscommunication is not only a default option, but it's actually an opportunity. The fact that miscommunication is going to happen means that I can learn from anyone at any time about what you think about the world and why you interpret it this way or that way. And all of that miscommunication opens up possibilities for me to see the world differently in some way. Okay? Now there's another thing that the metaphorical property of communication can do for us. Some of you who are familiar with POS may have experienced this one before, but metaphor makes resources mutable and sometimes even abundant. So in terms of resources, one of the basic assumptions of economics is that resources are scarce. But work that people in POS have done suggests that actually resourcing can happen. The resources can be, at least to some degree, abundant because we can use things. The simple fact that I may walk into your office and sit down on the the computer box that you're not using anymore means that I've turned that box into a chair, even though that doesn't normally fit into my definition of what a chair normally is. Well, whether it's with words or with relationships or with physical objects or whatever it is, because we can metaphorize pretty much almost anything, then we can find resources in all kinds of places where we might not normally look. Now, there's a limit to that. I'm not going to walk into your office and sit on your nice, expensive 100-year-old vase, because that's going to break and not be very comfortable anyways, and it won't serve the purpose. So there's obviously limits to it. But there are ways. The thing that metaphor does for us is it opens up this possibility of abundant resources. Now, these principles of communication, Gretchen mentioned a paper that Monica Werlein and I wrote on Flight 93. At the time, when we learned about that story, we were really moved and touched by that story and felt that we wanted to honor what those people had done in our own way. And in doing so, thought, one of the ways we could honor them is by trying to learn from them. And so we analyzed their story to answer the question, how did people engage in courageous collective action? What made it possible for them to do that in that situation? Now, what was interesting is when we first started working on this project, a lot of people thought, that's a dumb question. That wasn't even courage because, what are you going to do if they're going to blow up the ship? There's no really other logical option other than to, do a counterattack there. That criticism is a wonderful example of the property of expect miscommunication, because it doesn't understand that in the situation of what was actually happening. Prior, if we look at the context to that event, no hijacking had ever been conducted in that way, and all of the crew had been trained on how to respond to a hijacking, which was do whatever they ask, keep the passengers down, so on and so forth. There was no data for them to suggest that anything else was going on in the world or that there were other hijackings that day. All there was ambiguity and confusion. So what was the first thing they did when the hijackers went into the cockpit? They got on their cell phones and they did the things on the list from Axley's list about what you do to mitigate miscommunication. They triangulated. They got feedback. They checked secondary sources. They did all those things that it said that we should do to eliminate miscommunication. And while they weren't able to have a perfect idea of what was going on, they got a good enough idea that they made what we now know was a correct judgment for them in terms of what they should do. But that wasn't possible until they actually got that other communication, that reconfirmation, the context. Now, the second principle we talked about here was approach people to learn from them if you expect miscommunication. In this particular case, it was probably too late to do that with the people who hijacked their plane. Any true communication with them would have needed to have happened before they became radicalized and whatever else happened. But we do, on that flight, also have a wonderful example of resourcing. Because once they realized what was going on and they organized themselves into a collective, the collective itself was a resource. When they started talking in we instead of I, then they created themselves as an entity, as a resource that could act in that situation. And then they started doing other things as well. The serving cart became a battering ram. The boiling water in the coffee pots became projectile weapons. And all of these things got transformed into resources. They were, to the extent possible in a hijacked airplane, they were amazingly resourceful and creative in creating resources to help them with their purpose. So, let me click. Oh, shoot. This is what happens when I try to do things with my left hand. Okay, so we've suggested a few different ways to actually not just use our miscommunication as a problem to overcome, but actually as an opportunity for accomplishing positive things. One is to ask what we can learn from. So in terms of learning what we can from those that we want to communicate to, when we communicate to others, we expect others to get what we're saying. And if I begin by asking, what can I learn? If I'm going to go communicate to you, what can I learn from you? It changes the way I try to communicate to you from a to a with. Also, in terms of resourcing, Monica Werlein and Martha Feldman have a chapter in the recent handbook on positive organizational scholarship where they talk about 3 things you can do to help with your resourcing. 1, juxtapose familiar objects with unfamiliar objects. So an example of that would be the classic story about IDEO when they invented the Reebok shoe. And they they juxtaposed the idea of a, what's it called, padding in the shoe with a medical device plastic bag that they use to fill with air in the operations that people do. And by juxtaposing those, we're able to see, hey, you know what, we could actually put an inflatable bag inside people's shoes to create something new, and there was a whole new resource there. And so that juxtaposing ideas, how is X like Y, gives us insights into new things. Similarly, we can match unfamiliar contexts with familiar objects and vice versa. So a wonderful story, or a wonderful movie if you haven't seen it, is what is it called? The Pursuit of Happiness. Will Smith's movie where he plays Chris Gardner, who becomes an investment banker from living in poverty. And excellent examples where he gets thrown in jail the night before he's supposed to show up for an interview. He runs to the interview in his undershirt for an investment bank. And he takes this, which, you know, he walks in the room and people are like, you know, this guy smells, he's got paint all over him, he's wearing an undershirt in an investment bank, and he's asking for a job. And what do you think is going to happen there? And he actually turns that into a resource by taking something unfamiliar in a familiar context and asking, how can I use this? So at the end of the interview, the guy says, what would you say if somebody said you need to hire, you hired somebody who showed up to an interview in their undershirt? And he said, I would say he must have had really nice pants on. And the guys laughed and offered him a job. Bring familiar objects into new roles, which is what we see with the Flight 93 example. Familiar objects like a coffee pot or a serving cart, but in a completely new role. Here is counterattackers against a hijacker. And so we begin to see, as we juxtapose, match, and fit, and narrate new things, how there's lots of ways we can create and find resources we may never have thought they were before. All right? So back to our situation. Let's get specific. You're a coach, trainer, and you walk into a room. It's your first day in a new building. And in this new building, the building administrator introduces you to all the other employees. And you notice that there's another employee in the room that you know from outside of work, as this is a new building to you. And after the building administrator introduces you, this person that you know from outside of work starts going off in that meeting right there about how stupid this new training model is and how the organization never should have picked it up. Now, if we treat miscommunication as an opportunity, what do we do differently? Okay? Join in, start complaining about how stupid the... Okay, so I take it and say, you know, those things could be an issue. What can we do to make it good? Okay? Good. Yes?
You might try to draw from an example that person and I can both relate to where something seemed that way initially, but ended up turning out to be beneficial.
Okay, good. So you're trying to juxtapose over here. All right?
I would assume that the person has an image of what should be that leads to that critique. And I would ask what that image is, what really needs to be happening here.
Yeah, that's great. Did I see a hand here?
Yeah, I would assume that that person is not the only person in the world that thinks that. And I would ask you whether people agree with this. I would make a big list of what everybody sees, and then talking about why it's that way or why they see it that way, and what kinds of things might work instead, and making a big list.
Yep.
So we'd be putting it together as a group.
As a group. So we're doing the with rather than the to. Excellent. Okay, yeah. Okay. All right. So I think that's an excellent example. That's less one of these and more one of our previous list about clarifying communication. I just want to state that so we can see the difference between the two, but also useful.
It also be an opportunity to ask other people if they had experience, was it valuable as well, in their testimonials, having to be the authority telling them that it's good for them and getting
Yeah.
I think by doing that, by getting as many of them talking in that language, letting them vent, what I'm really learning is what their core needs and interests are. Because up until now, I don't know what that is, and I've been wasting my time because I'm not designing my effort to their core needs and interests. Now I have a chance to know what those are.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. Oh, go ahead.
I was thinking a lot of our contacts and behaviors, it's habitual and we've learned it over the period of our life. But this information to me causes you to be more creative, to think problems out differently, and not just using your habitual, reverting back to things that you're always familiar with or that not reverting to that similar context that has always gotten me through life. Actually stepping away from that and trying to look at things in a broader perspective.
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, what's interesting is in terms of actually doing this, one of the things, the first thing that the trainer who told me this story said is that she saw that person who she knew from out of that context, who she thought was a friend but now was lambasting her new job, and gut initial reaction was to be defensive, but then she did something different. She decided to see that person as a resource, which is akin to some of the things that you've said here. And so then, as soon as the meeting was over, she followed that person back to their class, to their room where they work, and she said to that person, "All right, what's going on here?" And did that kind of digging in, figuring out what's the communication. Found out that this person in their particular role had never received any help in any dimension from the central office. And that the rancor that she showed about this new issue was actually not about this new issue at all. It was about the dissatisfaction she had with central office initiatives in general. They talked. The trainer figured out all kinds of new ways she could help her out, but then also leveraged her to become a resource so that other people in the school all listened to her and participated with her and used her in that point moving forward. So did both the clarification to get from problem to neutral, but also went past neutral by using her as a resource, leveraging her, and taking it to a whole new level. Okay. I'm probably not going fast enough here. I better pay attention to the sign. Oh, boy, I'm way not going fast enough. Okay. I'm going to whiz a little bit here. You'll have to forgive me. Communication is organizing. So organizing is the arranging of actors and actions across time and space. Right? So when I organize, I'm saying that you, and you do this and this. Please do it at this time in this place. And that's basically this coordination process is what organizing is. Now, an example of that is the reorganization of the system itself. So this is my 2-year-old with her dad's empty wallet. We had to cut costs, so we reorganized. And in this situation, what they did is they saw, you know what, we aren't efficient enough or effective enough, and so we're going to get rid of the people who were in those previous departments were relocated to other places, organizing across time and space, and the people in the new department were brought in, and they created a new organization, a new way of operating together and coordinating with each other. Now, why is that important? Well, what that is, if I can push the right button here, is it's a story. A story is something that narrates characters or actors' activities across time and space to resolve a tension. Now, that means that all of our organizations and all of our organizational activities, in one way or another, are stories. They're not necessarily stories we tell, although we certainly can tell these stories, but often there's stories that we act out, like in a play or in a movie. This is important. There we go. Because in acting them out or telling them, there are some that are told, our strategies, our job descriptions, standard operating procedures. Sometimes we put them down on text. Other times we just act them out like perhaps a norm or a project or a presentation. But always and constantly we are living in a sea of stories as we organize our world. And all stories, Grima has shown, have the same basic underlying structure. An expected arrangement is violated, so there's some kind of problem created, and that's how we often label it. A protagonist is compelled to respond. The protagonist acquires gifts and encounters tests until finally they either succeed or fail at performing the resolution of the tension, and then they receive some kind of positive or negative sanction for their succeeding or failing at resolving the tension. And ultimately, all stories have this structure. We have more complex versions of it because you'll have stories within stories. We call them subplots. And so we're all participating in overlapped and embedded stories. So the trainers are assigned to get employees to populate. So given the lack of time, I'm not going to be able to do the same level of discussion here. But just to give an example, the trainers who are working on this were asked by the central office, listen, we put in a new knowledge management system and no one's using it. You go figure this out and tell us how we're going to get all these people using it and take care of this for us. Now, what's interesting about this example, I have to tell rather than discuss, is that this gave them a problem dictated to them by someone else, and the way they became heroes or heroines of this story was that they had to go out and get the right gifts and solve the problem, and if they did that, then they would win and get, nice rewards, and people would think they're great, and the story would have a happy ending. The trick about this is that we often assume when people give us stories to act out with the concomitant problems that they imply, they tell us where the power is. Whoever narrates and directs a story and others then follow are the ones who don't have power in the situation. And as a result, we often have stories imposed upon us that then we enact for other people and often don't stop and question, should this even be the story that I'm acting? Is there a different story I ought to be doing instead? And so that opens up the possibility of how would I do a different story. Bobby Parmar and I have written a paper about this, showing how in different situations, depending on how we communicate, we can empower ourselves by, instead of telling stories of acting out stories of submission, we can create new stories of either collaboration, domination, or even emancipation. So how do we do this? In the book that Gretchen mentioned that I wrote with my dad, we offer 4 questions for becoming a positive influence in any situation. What's interesting about these questions that we don't spend a lot of time on in the book, but that's relevant to how I'm talking about here in terms of communication, is that these questions are basically re-narrating questions. They're about telling the story differently. And so I can change the central tension of the story by asking, what results do I want to create? Instead of how do I accomplish the dictums that others have given me, what result do I want to create in this situation? With the plot and the moral, I can ask, what would my story be if I live up with the values I'm expecting of others? That story gives me a plot, and the values give me a moral for why I'm doing it. When I ask how others feel about this situation, I add characterization and even other points of views for telling the story with. And with asking for different strategies, I give myself gifts, new resources that I can create for accomplishing this, and the ability to improvise this story so that I may change it as I go along. So, oh man. This is, I was telling Gretchen at the beginning, I'm so used to having a clock in front of me when I present or teach that I'm not used to managing my time by walking back to the computer to get my clock. With the knowledge management system, you could, as a trainer, go out and say, hey, why aren't you doing this? And we treat it as an analysis, right? Once I have a problem, the appropriate thing to do is to analyze. I break it down. What's the problem? What gifts in the story language do I need to solve the problem? And then I figure it out through analysis. The alternative to that is that I can say, wait a minute, maybe that's not even the story I should be doing at all. So a quick example of that. A few years ago, I was working with a major firm. I was working actually with a small consulting firm who was consulting for a major firm. And they had major problems. They had grown inorganically without much of a strategy, and they were just a mess. And the financial companies were saying, you know what, you just got to divest all these pieces, and they threw in a new CEO to take care of it. And then they hired a couple of consulting firms to come in and help tell them how to do it. One of the consulting firms was a traditional consulting firm that you'd hire and they do their in-depth quantitative analysis and show you your finances and this is how it works out. And they did that on the biggest business in the company. And they walked in with their proud report of what they had done, delivered it on a national holiday to show how hard they had worked, and they never got past page 2. And they never got past page 2 because the CEO of the divisional unit looked at it and said, this is ridiculous, this is bad assumptions, this is wrong. Two brilliant men who had enormous opportunity to create value in the world basically submarined each other because they went straight to analysis without even defining the problem in the first place. The other consulting company had a different policy. Instead of analyzing all the financials, they just walked in with a blank page. They said, okay, first tell us what your situation is, and they'd list all the good and bad situation that they face, and they said, okay, now what do you want? Got a completely different result as people got energized about creating a new reality for their company instead of solving the problems that other people were telling them that they had. Okay, sorry I'm whizzing here. I got to work on my pacing apparently. All right, last observation from communication research is that truth is conferred through feeling. And this is where we'll get to some of the points that Emily was bringing up earlier. All right, so back to our trainers. To help them come up with a new story instead of just enacting stories that were imposed upon them, and they were doing a good job of that. We were just trying to help them crystallize it. We sat down, had a 2-day workshop with them to help them really clarify what their mission was. So we put it together. They had a great mission. And here's the problem. You've got 30 trainers in the room. They're all really psyched about this new mission. And then you've got thousands of other people in the organization who weren't in the room, had nothing to do with it, that you're going to go out and try to influence them. Their mission was basically to change the culture of the organization to increase the effectiveness. And so as you can imagine, one of the trainers goes out, and one of the things that she experiences is she gets out there and sees a situation that one of the employees is working in with client service and helps them develop, not one of the employees, a little team of employees, and helps them develop a collaborative approach that's completely new and exciting and interesting for how to manage this. And the minute she suggests this approach to them, she gets criticisms. Criticism number one, it's completely impractical. Look how much time we have to do it. There's no way we can get it done in that amount of time, and we have all these constraints and regulations that we have to live up to. So it's impractical. Number two, it's just untrue. This never works. So we know that you're saying collaboration is great. We know collaboration is stupid. It's better when you do it by yourself. And so don't give us these stupid ideas. And then number three, it's really immoral too, because we have to live up to these regulations by the government, the laws that have been passed. If we don't check off the list instead of doing all this, collaborative mumbo jumbo, then we won't meet the needs of our clients. Our clients will be less served, and we're treating them immorally as well, and everything's rejected right from the outset. Now, what's interesting about that is this notion of truth. They present those as rational arguments. The fact is that the coach could very easily present all the rational arguments against it back. And in the end, the argument isn't about rationality. It isn't about that at all. What it's about is how they feel about it in the moment. Quick example. In talking about how truth comes to be accepted, how communication comes to be accepted, Taylor and Van Every say that people narrate the routine activities of social life that they adhere to as truth. When the narration is so faithful to what is known, the author vanishes and the story is accepted as truth. Moral authority, then, is conferred upon a voice when it feels, note the key word there, feels authentic to the community. How would you say that in your own words? Just one person. That last sentence, if you're going to restate that in your own words, how would you say it?
If somebody feels authentic, you buy it.
Yeah, exactly. And authenticity can come in a number of ways, but that's really what we're looking for in the end. In fact, if you go back to that story of the consulting with a large conglomerate firm, that's really what that divisional CEO was looking for. When the guy plopped that, reams of paper on his desk saying this is the problem with your organization, he wasn't looking for that. He was looking for feeling. The people who requested them to go out and come up with a new strategy weren't looking for knowledge that they wouldn't ever have the time to digest about the financials of the organization. They wanted communication that felt authentic to them so they knew that they would be able to trust the leaders of the organization to do a good job. All right. Similarly, from sociology, we have Collins. The acceptance of routines is subject to self-interested maneuver, but the negotiations are carried on implicitly. The mechanism is emotional. It's that emotion on which we gauge where truth is conferred, whether that's truth about what's true, what's moral, or what's practical. We're looking to see if we feel it. So if you look then on how people change what we believe in the institutions or the texts that we accept in society, you can get a long list of influence tactics. You know what? If you hear it enough, people start to believe it. Or you can make appeals to authority. Or if it's good performance, people will accept good performance. And all of these influence tactics are great. And I actually could have listed probably 100 more. And at the same time, they're all based on rationality and like how I'm going to logic people into things. And they have emotional components, but they're mostly about convincing in one form or another. One that I like, oh, that didn't, oh, that's just because it's the title. In an article that is kind of buried in a journal called Social Interactionism from like 20 years ago that I found one time by a woman named, I think it's Patricia Wozliewski, and I'm probably pronouncing it wrong. She had this idea, you know, that back from the days of Weber, he said, there's these people who have charisma, and we follow them, and it's a property that they have. And she says, I don't buy it. I don't think people have charisma. I think charisma is a process. And sometimes people act in charismatic ways, and sometimes they don't. But the process looks like this, and she came to it from analyzing people like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, and showed that what they do is they articulate the feelings of others. Once I know that you feel the way I feel, and I'm willing to accredit you that trust because I can see that you feel the way I feel, then you can come in and disrupt that emotional order and say, so I get it, I totally get it. But, you know, we also need to consider this. And then you can start introducing other things because I've established that. Then that leads to plans for change, and then we can pull on other emotional stories and narratives to help us come in and motivate something new. And so if you think that about in terms of these trainers and what tactics would you use, how could you use a process like this to help that trainer get those employees to buy into the new collaborative client service model that she was proposing? What would it look like if we were doing this emotional process? Yeah. Okay. Let me actually, instead of answering that, throw that out quick. How do you articulate the feelings of others? Do you know what their feelings are?
I think that links back to the number 2 earlier, where I said if we're listening to that venting, instead of shutting that off and offending, hearing it, actually facilitating it. The claim I made was we begin to see their needs and interests by beginning to read their feelings. And that's the whole challenge. That's the invisible part of communication. When we connect there, people start to change. And that's what I meant about the list being dribble. The social science analysis is like consulting analysis that you described the first time. And it gives these little mechanical tools that can give incremental improvements, but it's not going to lead to change. Trainers just do the same thing over.
All right, I got to talk quick here. Excuse me. That's my signal that I'm almost out of time. I think that's right, and there's a lot of other ways we can build on that. Sometimes it's just that you've been participating in a community, so you know how the community feels. Sometimes it's just because you've taken the time to engage that person, whatever it may be. So in the case of Martin Luther King, for example, if you look at the I Have a Dream speech, how did he know what feelings to articulate in the people he was speaking to? Well, he had been with them, lived with them, had the fire hose turned on him, you know, whatever else. And so he was there and able to communicate those feelings. All right, so speeding along here really quickly. All right. Now, the problem is that effective influence is not necessarily positive influence. Right? We have plenty of examples. We don't have to go very far back in history to see where people have charismatically wielded the crowd to very not good ends. And so if you look at the literature on influence tactics and so forth, we find that most of them actually don't really talk about ethics much. What they do is at the end they say, oh yeah, make sure you use these ethically. And if we go to the ethics literature, 2,000 years of ethical philosophy, moral philosophy, tells us that we need to use various moral philosophies in various ways to exercise good judgment. Problem is judgment really the solution? One of the problems with judgment is that people don't make judgments. There's a lot of psychological research that suggests that people actually just act and then justify their actions later, and that very few of the things we do in life are actually based on considered judgment. That may sound strange. I can provide lots of data on that, but we're out of time, so I won't do that here. But the net effect is that Jonathan Haidt wrote a very influential paper a few years ago where he said, you know what, when it comes to moral decision making, our emotional our emotional tail wags our rational dogs all the time. That we're just acting on impulse and emotion and not really thinking through these things. I'd give an example about that, but I'm sorry, I got to quickly move on. Also, in addition to unknown motives, we don't know the consequences of our actions. We may do something that has great intent that as a decision seemed to fit moral philosophies and then ends up having some unintended consequence that we were completely unprepared for but that wasn't a positive one. And finally, we get to the question of exclusion, which we hear in positive organizational scholarship when some critics will say, positive for whom? The fact is no decision can include everybody in it. So there's always someone excluded that it's not positive for, and you're not being positive for everyone. And these are legitimate concerns. They open up the question, though, that maybe 2,000 years of focus on judgment might not be the optimal focus. That we might be better off on focusing on conversation. That in a conversation, we can probe others on what their motives are. Conversations are ongoing. So decisions and their consequences are just parts. They're just texts within an ongoing conversation that we can incorporate and learn from later. The time allows us to include. So even if I can't include you in this decision, if we are part of a conversation, we continue to engage each other, then I will be able to include you in the conversation as we move along, and that the moralness of the conversation depends on a process over a time rather than having to be perfect in any given moment when a decision is made. And finally, the ongoing engagement means that I can also engage with various moral philosophies and their positions. So I can say, you know, well, what do you think? Is this about consequentialism? Are we getting the best outcome for people? Or is it really that we should just live up to our virtues no matter what they are? And what are those virtues? And in that conversation, as it unfolds, if we're probing on these things, the thing that we're looking for to see how moral our conversations are is understanding. And this takes us back to emotion, because I cannot say I understand another unless I feel how she feels. So what do I mean when I say that? I mean, if I have my MBA student over here who's a conservative, Republican, Friedman-esque, got to have free markets person. I have my SNRE student over here who's going to take down the man and be against the institutions and liberal as can be. And they say, you know what, I understand the other. I know her arguments are X, Y, and Z. And she says, I know his arguments. They're A, B, and C. No, you haven't understood each other. All you've done is taken logical perspectives. Until I get down to that level of emotion, then the understanding hasn't existed and the communication isn't there. Sorry, Gretchen. Anyways, 2 things and I'm done. Much faster than I should have been, and it's my fault. Our influence, then, is unlikely to be positive if we don't also open ourselves up to be influenced by others, which is why my title will use the word co-authoring exceptional realities. It's when we co-author these by allowing ourselves to be influenced as well as to influence that we can say that we're really achieving something positive. Okay, so here's the practical items. If we had time, we would discuss how we could do it. But the sum of this is that we can take each of these points. Miscommunication is the norm. Communication is organizing, and truth is conferred from feeling, and flip them around to use them towards exceptionally positive ends and not just solve them as problems. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan, for such a stimulating talk with a lot of practical things. I think we're all going to be a lot more aware of that potential for miscommunication and what we can do to do a better job at it. So thank you for opening our eyes to those possibilities. Thank you very much all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next month for our final in this academic series of POSLinks. So thank you very much. And if you have questions for Ryan, I'm sure he'd be happy to stay for a few minutes to answer or talk with you about those.